I'm a little speechless because both of these people are so important in my field, and I think also as friends. But I just want to thank the TCA and Landmarks for welcoming us and giving us an opportunity to do this. Thank you.
It's really just such an honor to be here on such a lovely night with you all and with such incredible, it's been such a pleasure to be able to think about your work, to really spend time delving into, this years of practice, and then to have this experience of I'm brand new to Austin, and then, having been here only 3 months, right, my kind of landing and seeing this incredible exhibition in this beautiful space with an artist whose work I care deeply about and am very invested in, and so to see it showcased so in such a beautiful fashion, right, and to see it received so well is really incredibly welcoming, right. I'm very happy.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. First of all, I would like to thank the teams of Landmarks and Contemporary Austin for making this conversation possible. I would say that I know Eamon's work since 2018, approximately, when Ondine and I were working together back in Lima as curatorial advisors of the Committee of Contemporary Art in the Lima Art Museum. And in that occasion, Ondine showed and shared with us some of Eamon's work. But I didn't have the chance to fully engage with Eamon's practice until I received Andres' invitation to work on the curatorial essay that accompanies the Landmarks Commission. So it has been, the whole situation has been a fantastic surprise for me, and also a situation of learning. And I'm very happy to be here. I don't know exactly how we could initiate this conversation, probably asking Eamon some questions.
Yeah.
So I can start with an easy one, I hope.
Yeah.
For a visitor or an audience who's maybe just becoming familiar with your work, and I just can't think of a kind of better, more stunning way to be introduced to your work than this exhibition that Miranda and Julie put together here. I think there's a way in which the show is organized with, in particular here, that's so dramatic, right? And to go from the ground floor with the figurative work and to see that earlier body of work, and then to have the experience of walking up the stairs and just being, awestruck by the dynamism, right, and the monumentality, and this move from figuration to abstraction, right? It's particularly dramatic in this exhibition space. And so for an audience who's just becoming familiar with your practice, and even this, we've been saying this is an exhibition that focuses on 2 to 3 bodies of work. It's not a comprehensive retrospective. It doesn't have that. It's not trying to be either.
Right.
But what are some of the kind of connections or through lines across your trajectory that may not be so obvious to the viewer who's just getting to know your work? That kind of, how do you see this movement in your practice between the figurative work to the more abstract work?
Yeah, I think Florencia addresses, or she goes towards these ideas in the essay that she writes for the piece at Landmarks. But, for me, it's this idea of abstraction not as just a formal exercises in formalism, but more of abstraction as a means to reflect philosophical viewpoints. And so that figurative work on that first floor lays the groundwork, I think, for understanding the human element that sometimes abstraction can kind of not that isn't so perceptible in the abstract work sometimes, because there is this balance between a certain universalism in abstraction, you know, and the history of abstraction as well, in the ways that we interpret it, that I think being able to kind of get that more personal fidelity of my life, and it's very autobiographical in a lot of ways. Like those works are, a lot of them are family members. Some of the dancers are family members as well, and so they're both reflections of kind of my politics, the way I see the world, reflections on social structures that are reflected in like society in Peru that also kind of echo out into the United States as well and throughout Latin America, but also even just down to the formal aspect of the manner in which they're painted, the touch, the feel, the delicate, you know, details that then when they're moved into that second floor and you see those more monumental scale pieces, it's still done with that same touch. It's all handmade. It still has that same kind of attention paid. So I think to me, it's like there's always this kind of I think we have this notion that, or we've been conditioned to have this notion that like artists a lot of times there's a certain purity to the way that they come into their vision. And what I like about the figurative, especially in this exhibition, we were able to expand on the figurative work in this exhibition, whereas in Denver it was much smaller. There was like, I think 6 works in the figurative. So it kind of disrupts that notion of like, I think if it was only the works on the second floor, I think it would kind of feed into that notion of like this very pure form of how an artist arrives at a certain vision. And also I think it ties it to a specific place, the abstraction into a specific place and a specific culture.
I have one question. I think that looking retrospectively to your practice, as we can do in the show that is downstairs, we could say that your practice generates a shared space where European, pre-Columbian, contemporary indigenous, and popular Latin American culture can coexist, you know? And this is very evident, for example, in your more figurative paintings, you know, in which depict scenes of your daily life, you know, in which these social structures are very evident, but sometimes, you know, they are part of our daily lives, so we don't recognize them as social forces acting, right. You know, so it's very interesting the way in which, I don't know, your family memories, you know, fuse with scenes of restaurants in Arizona, in Tucson, no?
Yeah.
And there's a social critique behind the paintings, you know, but it's a social critique that is how do you say this? Is said, I don't know if it's the exact word.
You can say it in Spanish.
O sea, I even remember how to say it in Spanish at the moment. Sorry. No, but the thing is, what happens, you know, when you elevate these discussions to abstraction?
Yeah.
Which has such a heavy history in art history, you know, and it's so related to like a European North Atlantic genealogy, you know? So I found that amazing, you know, like coming from the first floor towards the second floor and finding that Julie gave me a tour to the show this morning, and we were discussing exactly this point, no? Mm-hmm. So how this critique is present in both moments of your practice, but in such a different way, because in the figurative paintings is more related to daily life, and then, you know, you work around abstraction, and it's huge legacy, no?
Yeah, I think like when in 2017 I lived in Guadalajara, Mexico, and I was given a residency for I think 3 months in Jose Clemente Orozco's old studio, and it is bigger than this space. It's huge because he was one of the great muralists. And I think something in that experience and being around his work, seeing his murals at the Palacio Municipal, where it has the Nazis fighting the communists and the priests, and Quetzalcoatl, the snake, is like devouring all these weapons in its mouth, and it's a very dark vision, very like Mexican goth. And when I coming out of that experience, I thought about public works in Latin America and the tradition of modernism in Latin America, and how a lot of them were associated with municipal functions and sculptures, in public sculptures, and everything had to kind of take on this kind of scale. And I just kind of thought, like, I got invited by the Hammer Museum in Los Angeles to create a mural in their entry, their atrium. And it presented a great opportunity to kind of expand on these ideas of, like, what is lineage? And you know, I view my lineage as very, I'm kind of an omnivore in that sense. Like, for me, I pulled from the Mexican muralists as well, just by being in proximity to them and growing up on the border near Mexico. I have a very close relationship to Mexico. I have family that migrated there, and so I pulled from that, and I pulled from ideas of Brazilian abstraction to think about kind of that lineage and that history in the same ways that the figurative work is playing with, like, the dancers that you'll see in the works are reflecting social structures in the Andes that are about the master, the colonized, and the people in between, and everybody kind of doing this dance, doing this kind of ritualized dance. So to me, that's the thread. Those are the kind of, to me, the magic where those two reside. You know, I think now the figurative work is almost like a maybe a memoir from the past, and right now the second floor is a broadening of the conversation to the public. Like the first floor is a bit more of like me reflecting on my own life, not even really expecting these things to be seen a lot of times, or at least at this level. But the second floor is much more of these bigger conversations, social conversations. The works, the Talking Shit series in the front that greets you when you walk up the stairs, the Talking Shit with Amaru. We were talking about this just before coming here. You know, in some ways it was a reaction to some of, like, my education, where if I was in school, I know that if I made a painting of Quetzalcoatl, my teachers would probably not, they'd roll their eyes and not know how to even engage it. So why not make a painting of Quetzalcoatl? But do it through this lens of this modern era, of like, what did modernism do to these objects? And how do they function in my repertoire and my life?
Thank you. I got to, as I was preparing for writing the essay, we had a number of conversations, and one of the things that you said that stuck with me, and then I tried to explore and unpack a little bit more in the essay what had to do with your experience encountering the sonidero DJs in Mexico City, and how much both the music and the kind of public performance of the DJing and the kind of different social forms that took place in the performance of the dance, and also the kind of that the sonidero culture being a space of kind of connection and communication across distance. And one of the things that really struck me in that early conversation was you said that one of the things that you were really interested in was the way that those DJs, right, in particular the sonideros in Mexico City, were looking south, right? They were looking to the music of Central America, South America, and the Andes, rather than this kind of standard kind of Eurocentric kind of music way of always looking north, right? Looking to North America or looking to Europe, and how that kind of, you said you were really struck by this, the looking south, and started thinking about models for what it meant to look south for one's kind of inspirations, right? Or models for production and creativity. And as we talked about it more, there were other examples, right? The sonideros was certainly one, and then also Joaquin Torres Garcia's, right, inverted map from the 1940s, and also this idea of the Southern Cross or the Crux constellation, which figures in some of the works, right? This constellation, which is kind of best seen from the south. So this idea of like, what would it mean to look at the stars from the south? Right. So I'm just curious if you could just help unpack that a little bit more of what it means to you to look south for these different genealogies.
Yeah, so what Andine is referring to is there are these sound systems in Mexico City that have been going since the 60s, mid-60s, and a lot like you'll hear about in Jamaica, Jamaican sound systems, but these ones are specific to Mexico City. And they're working class sound systems, and they would do the parties for the weekends, and they do the parties at the markets and stuff like that. And those DJs, they were also, what was really fascinating, there's also this element to them of like a safe space for queer people too, and it's kind of this autonomous space. And what I was always drawn to by it was I would hear them playing Peruvian music, and they were really obsessed with like Peruvian and Colombian music, and music that I was like really struck by, because in Peru I don't even think those musicians or that people knew that there was popularity out there in Mexico of this music. And usually the Peruvian music that they would play is like kind of their top shelf in their collection, like, because they were so kind of rare even to the sound systems in Mexico, and they were, and it was the type of music too that even in Peru people had already thrown out. They were like, oh, that's old music, and so I was fascinated by that. And so to me, what their orientation was, instead of like looking to like Europe or the United States for their pop music and to play disco or to play electronic music and stuff, it was like they were pivoting and looking south and looking for this different horizon. And to me, that really struck me. And I thought, what does it mean to orient your body to the south? What does it mean to orient your vision? And does your brain follow that? And then where do you go with that? And so you'll see that in my music as well as DJ Lengua. Like that's the core of what my identity as a DJ is. But also they do have a certain omnivorous element to themselves as well, because they will play really kitschy, weird, high energy stuff in between songs while they're announcing things, and then they'll go back to some Peruvian cumbia or, and so that really informed the kind of conceptual philosophy of my painting practice in that sense.
I think what you just said allows me to make the following question. Your show here focus mainly on your paintings. However, you are like a, let's say, transdisciplinary artist, and you're working a lot with music, with video, and also with collaborative projects. Could you tell us more about these other projects and how they influence also your painting practice?
Yeah, so I think part of like my anarchist roots make me a bit more comfortable with collaboration and thinking of like my community as like an outgrowth of my individual, or vice versa, my individual vision as an outgrowth of my community. And so I think like, you know, the video work to me is really an opportunity to combine the sound. You know, it's such a unique medium to be able to really create. As a painter, you're always working within this certain kind of frame. And so it translates perfectly into video or film. And then this added element that you can add music and sound, and that can also kind of make what the viewer seeing much more profound and complex. But I think it's interesting that it's like, you know, there is sometimes a desire to kind of compartmentalize the genres, you know, and be like, this is that, and never the twain shall meet. But I think like the painting has always been, it's like something that is a personal conversation maybe, or something that's more intimate in that sense. And the video work and the collaborative is kind of like the more social side of me, you know, the side of me that's more interested in the magic that happens when you're working with other artists and they have opinions, and that to me, I'm really drawn to that. Yeah.
And you are a repeat collaborator, right?
yes, many different collaborations. Yes. Right now, yesterday or day before, an article came out in the LA Times about a collaboration that I did with Julio Morales called Los Hijackers. And it's a long story. You can read about it in the LA Times. It's very, very complex. But essentially, it's a piece a video piece about, and a sculptural piece about entitled Migrant Dubs, about a migratory sound system, a sound system that traveled across the border. And it started at LACMA, traveled to the Museo de Tamayo in Mexico City, to the Zapopan in Guadalajara, San Antonio, and then ended in the Museo de Barrio in New York. And this was in 2008. And that project, at the end of it, I couldn't take care of the cube. It was this huge sculpture. And so I had to let it go. And fast forward 7 years, it was put onto Craigslist. And a DJ in LA found it. And he took it to Pasadena and he reconstructed it. And now it's an audio studio in his backyard. And you can read all about it. So yeah, to me, those are those magic, you know, elements that when you work collaboratively and you kind of let the world kind of take its course. Yeah.
And I've been thinking a lot about this article that Carolina Miranda wrote, and because it was through Migrant Dubs, I think that we first met.
Yeah.
Through the Phantom Sightings exhibition that I first became familiar with your practice, and that was only one small corner of it. And it is a kind of amazing project that you did with Los Hijackers, right? The idea was that this was a sculptural installation and video, and that as the exhibition traveled, right, the mobile studio would travel and you would work with local bands.
Yeah.
You'd find local bands, right, to perform and record in the studio and make new videos, so to produce new work as the exhibition traveled. And in this essay, which I encourage you all to read, that Carolina Miranda wrote, you know, she talks about the kind of incredible unanticipated saga,
Yeah.
right? This kind of this object that was created for an exhibition and then had this unanticipated afterlife, right?
Yeah.
You know, by literally being like, what am I going to do with this? Well, put it on Craigslist, and then it continues to kind of circulate and migrate, right? Which is so already kind of a metaphor for the idea about music and cultural adaptation and movement across genres and movement of individuals and new creative forces that come to play through the expression of music. But one thing that really struck me about this story that Carolina tells, which is about you and your collaboration with Julio, but also about DJ Scooby, right? Is that she makes a suggestion that technically, or maybe ideally, that today this object, while still being used by a DJ, right, being abandoned in some ways, right, and being reclaimed and readapted, right, by someone that did not create it, but is able to recustomize it and utilize it as a recording studio for their practice and the practice of others. She makes this suggestion, and I think it's a very profound one, that in some ways it's fulfilling the kind of goals, the aesthetic goals of the piece, much more, and more to the kind of goals that you and Julio envision, than if LACMA, the museum, had acquired it.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, to me, that was when she called me and asked me about it. I think, and most people that have asked me about it, they maybe are expecting me to be, I don't know, to be upset that maybe it's in somebody else's hands now, and which, I'm sure that's a valid opinion, but it was to the contrary with Julio and I. We were both just, when we saw it in this backyard, and it had a pitched roof, and it has an air conditioner unit attached to it, and windows at the top, and the mirrors that we had painted were kind of cracked, and it had shown its wear. It was closer to our heart in a lot of ways, because it was like speaking to the ways that you customize things in your life, and especially in Latin America, it reflected that kind of improvised architecture and improvised community in a lot of ways. Like, so this guy, Scooby, that ended up with the cube, he's from Michoacan, Mexico, and he's here on a temporary visa. And so this article also comes out at a really interesting time where it might help him extend his visa. So there's all these kind of, we call the video piece that we did of this whole saga is called Psycho Magic, because it really is psycho magic. Well, but real quick, I'm sorry, but I think you're right. Like the idea of like it being acquired by LACMA, which it was commissioned originally by LACMA, and when I approached them to please take it because I didn't have enough money to take care of it anymore, and they said no. It was better for it because it would have maybe been brought out every 10 years to be shown in this pristine space and be this rarefied object, And I think that's, there's a more profound kind of or deeper conversation, I think, when it's in relation to painting, because painting is almost designed for that in a certain way. Like, in the way that I see the gestures that I'm making towards historical gestures, towards disrupting the conversation and disrupting the center of what abstraction has been, where it's been rooted, is the key component to that is that it goes into the pristine space, and then in the video and the music and those things, it's for it it's to avoid the clean, pristine space, because that then freezes it in this certain way. It doesn't continually living. And the thing about migrant dubs was about sound does not stop at the border, like it continues in the people and wherever the people are, and so and that's,
and it continues to change. It continues to be adapted, and
right. And the Peruvian music in Mexico didn't stop in the border of Peru. In Mexico, it was reimagined. It was like, and to be honest, I know that maybe I'm getting a lot of blank looks because you're like, what is this music? I want to know what he's talking about. The Mexico DJs did it, an extra thing to make it even more different is they played the music, on a 45 record is a small record. You play it at 45 RPMs. They played the Peruvian 45s at 33 RPMs. So they slow it down. So something that would be like, it's like, so they, and then the voice is like, very low, because it's being warped, and it becomes another genre. And so that's called rebajada. There's guys that specialize in that. And it's that customized culture. Mexico does it really well. Mexico is obsessed with the customized culture, which is really, like, to me, informed my whole, artistic core in some ways. Yeah.
And the Tejano Rascuache mode is very aligned with that as well,
definitely.
right?
Yeah.
So I see where I totally am inspired by these ideas, and I think that you're right. I mean, what's also about this project that's so interesting is the afterlife of it inspired a new collaboration and a new work, right? Even though it has its autonomous piece that has continued with DJ Scooby, and I think you're right to point out that for your paintings that's another story, right? But I think the other thing that's interesting is I do think this is a model that continues in your practice. If we think about like the Talking Shit series, which is also featured downstairs, there's a way in which those paintings also had another afterlife, which are not featured in the exhibition, but I write about, and they're in the catalog, which is as a tapestry, right, and as a poncho that's worn in a performance, and an installation, and another collaboration with Rafa Esparza. So I guess I wanted to ask you a little bit more about these modes of these kind of creative afterlives that sometimes you do kind of create, even with more pristine objects that are more formal, pristine objects.
Yeah. The Talking Shit series is, the two layers to it is that formal object and the formal study of pre-Columbian deities and form. And that was inspired really by this quote by Octavio Paz when he talked about Coatlicue, the two-headed serpent goddess in the Aztec pantheon. And he speaks about how she was a goddess, and then when the Spaniards came, they buried her because they were afraid of her. And then when they re-excavated her like 100 years after that, or 200 years after that, they were still afraid of her, but she was like a monster. And so they put a cloth over her and they hid her in the corner of a convent. And it sat there for 200 some years. And it wasn't until the modern era, when they built the anthropological museum, the modernist masterpiece, that's when Coatlicue was then brought out and now is the kind of crown jewel of that collection. And I was fascinated with that idea in terms of like the modernist era kind of ushering in this kind of like disarming of the form or the history of the form, and maybe that universal ability. And in Mexico, it's so tied to like indigenismo is so tied to like a government program post-revolution. And I was really interested in that kind of layer. But then, to me, then the personal layer to it, and this gets a little bit more complicated because I don't totally know if I live entirely in the binary of a struggle between the colonies and the colonizer and all of that. Like I don't struggle with that. I'm more of like a reflection of it. But is when I think of the second layer to that body of work is the personal. And like I have family that during certain political uprisings and movements in Peru, they were exiled from Peru, and the only place that they could go was Mexico. And Mexico welcomes a lot of different political exiles from Latin America. And so to me, I was thinking about my relationship to Mexico in this way where it's like this almost like surrogate mother in some ways, and Coatlicue is kind of like that too. And also kind of, I really push back against that notion of like, Coatlicue is actually the Virgin Mary. It's like, no, she isn't. I really, like, she is who she is. And then, and that personal experience of my relationship to other Mexican artists as well. And so when Rafa Esparza invited me to do that piece, I was in Guadalajara at the time, and I decided to have the painting made into a poncho that you could wear. And it was the beginning of the conversation. It was the more personal conversation of like, let's get away from this monolithic conversation about like who we are because I think especially nowadays, especially as Latinx came in, it's like the broadening of the conversation about like the personal experiences that we have with memory and these places. And so this is the more what I was getting at earlier, the thing that I'm a little bit still tossing around is sometimes I think that experience that Coatlicue had from monster to masterpiece that Octavio Paz talks about is sometimes there's an element of that in our lives, in our kind of like certain shames that we have of that we were raised without seeing images of ourselves in popular culture, or if we are, they're always misrepresented. They're like over dramatic or these certain ways, and then also this like, but then at the end it's like the masterpiece, you know, when you come to an acceptance and an understanding, but what do you lose in that, you know? So those are the ideas that I'm still tossing around. And so it requires an activation of a performance in that. It can't just live as the pristine object in that conversation. It then has to be brought out to allow, so with Rafa, he's the only person so far that's performed with it, but and he did some varieties off of it about each deity, we call it like talking shit with the deity. So then his was talking shit with Tlaloc, the rain god, and he did that in Mexico, out in the field. And he enacted this kind of performance about, I think, his own troubled memory and relationship with Mexico in some ways, which I thought was really, like, to me, that's the essence of when to make it performative. And I hope in September I'm going to be debuting works in this series at Cohan Gallery in my show in September. And I'm inviting a Peruvian sound artist to do a performance there, and I hope to also do a performance. His name is Alan Poma, and I'm really curious to see that. To me, that's the essence of that. Sorry, off on tangent.
Well, I have a couple of questions. One of them is asking you about, I know migration, diaspora are recurrent subjects in your work. And you're an artist that was like educated in the United States in a kind of formal, traditional education, but you wanted to, learn more, and you have spent long formative periods in Guadalajara and also in Huancayo in Peru. I wanted to know what, meant for you facing these other art histories or parallel art histories, what that gave to your current work. And also I would like to you to tell us a little bit more about Tras los Ojos, which is the public commission that you did for Landmarks.
Yeah, so the first question, when I came out of undergrad, there was about 9 years between undergrad and grad school. And in that time period, I kind of was a little bit disillusioned, didn't want to work, just wanted to kind of just do my own thing. And when I kind of started coming back to painting, I had decided that I wanted to explore my own education, like make my own education. And I did have a professor at the Art Institute by the name of Carlos Villa, an incredible Filipino-American artist. And he gave me the license in a lot of ways to explore my roots. And because he had done the same when it was very out of vogue in his generation. And so I decided to go to Peru. There were other familial reasons why I went there that time, and it was it's kind of dramatic, but I went there, and when I was there, I went to Morococha, a little mining town I think it's the highest copper mine in the world. I think at like 14,000 feet. And my uncle and we stopped, and he said, "Oh, hey, I want you to check out these paintings. They're in this little church. I think you would really like these paintings, and I know the artist." And I was like, "Oh, sure." And so we stopped and we went into the church, and it's a really intense town. It's like very bleak. It's just big mine tailings and shacks and this little church there, and we go in, and it's the Stations of the Cross, but painted in this psychedelic style, like just super vibrant, and everything's kind of biomorphic and changing into things, and almost looks like someone on ayahuasca had painted them, you know. And they such a contrast to the harshness of that world up there, and I immediately was like, "Oh, I want to know who this guy is." And he's like, "Oh, he's my neighbor. Like, we'll go." And that's always how it is. My uncle, like, it's like, "Oh, I know that guy." And so we go to Huancayo, and sure enough, he introduces me to Josue Sanchez. And then I stayed for a year working with Josue Sanchez. He just said, "Yeah, you can have a studio in my room." And he would paint on bed sheets because they didn't have canvas, you know? So he would paint on bed sheets. And some of my favorite paintings that I got from him, you flip to the back side and you see, like, you know, kind of like a 1980s version of, like, Peppa the Pig, you know? Or, like, it's like this extra layer, the rascuache kind of. And we just fell in love with each other and on this artistic level, you know, and it gave me that, it re-inspired me after the institution, you know. I came back from that experience jazzed about painting, you know, and being like, oh, it has this social function and it can function in my life too, and, you know, and so I came back, and that's when I started to make the paintings about the steakhouses in Arizona, and I started to try to create this, like, fictional space where Peru and Arizona and Mexico kind of existed. And so that's why there's an element of surrealism to those paintings, you know. And the people also have elements of nature. They kind of are forming into mountains or plants and things like that. And then the second question, oh yeah, the Tras los Ojos. So the piece that you'll see at Landmarks at UT is titled Tras los Ojos. And, you know, in the tradition of working with public art and in the public sphere, I really wanted to know who inhabits this building, who is in this building every day, and it's the psychology building. And so we had a Zoom with the faculty and in the department, and, you know, the thing that came to my mind was psychology has these very literal tools that they use to, you know, psychology broke away from, used to be part of philosophy, but psychology broke away from philosophy when it was, like, more diagnostic. It became, like, diagnostic about the ways that we perceive the world. And I was really fascinated by the ways in which those diagnostics are, like, created. So, like, how do you represent, you know, these almost, like, unseen forces? And so they sent me all these screen grabs of their different tools that they use, and I have always been kind of fascinated by, like, how the color and form really, like, what I'm doing, ultimately the premise of what I'm doing is trying to make it, like, be unmoored from the, like, formal exercise, but at the same time, like, I am interested in the universality on some level. I like that you know, people you can bring whatever you want to the work as well, and so I was interested in that just the hierarchy of perception and these forms, and a lot of them kind of reflected, the forms in the painting kind of reflect the way the eyeball functions. You know, there's circle that is like a beam of a shape is touching it really at a point, and then it's exploding out into another form. and the hierarchy in which the painting was created is kind of there to allow the viewer to kind of travel through the painting and up to the top. So to me, like that's like the focus behind it, at least like when I approached like the actual making the painting. Yeah.
I had a follow-up question about the approach to the public work, because you've now done a handful, right, of large-scale public commissions, right?
Yeah.
Subway stop in New York,
Yeah.
right? The TIAA building,
Yeah.
also in New York. LA.
LA Metro is going to be in 25. Yeah.
So is the approach to the publicly cited work, is it the same approach that you take with the paintings in your studio?
A little bit, but it's definitely like taking the viewer and the people that are going to live with the work into account. I'm getting ready to do a piece for the U.S. consulate in Hermosillo, Sonora, and my original design was kind of inspired by America Invertida, the drawing of South America flipped upside down. And because the design was created so that if like a giant were to pick up the consulate and flip it upside down, like it would stay, you would read it, you would perceive it the same way almost. Because it was following that idea of like seeing the southern horizon, and that it's not just a one-way route. Like nobody talks about how many Americans live in Mexico. Nobody talks about how American culture is affecting Mexico. You know, it's always like
The two-way traffic.
yeah, the two-way traffic, and how people on the border actually really intimately understand that. You know, it's not so binary. You know, and how politicians try to like paint it into a one-sided thing, like they're all bad and they're bringing these bad things, you know. But so yeah, I always try to have that layer to my approach in the public works especially. Yeah. Sure, yeah. Oh, I think.
Hello. Okay, we're gonna open up for questions, y'all. I'll come around with the mic, so all you do have to raise your hand, and I'll scoot on over to you. Does anyone have any questions? There you are.
Thank you for the wonderful talk. I was just curious so you mentioned that when you worked with Josue Sanchez, that he had on the back of his paintings the...
I'm sorry, I can't hear you that well.
I'm terribly sorry. You mentioned that on the back of the Josue Sanchez paintings that there were bed sheets. Did you hide any bed sheets in any of the art downstairs?
No. But some of them are very much like just canvas that I found, like wasn't, you know, like art canvas per se, like more of like at a fabric store in the fabric district. Yeah.
Hi. I was wondering if you could talk about the significance of the name of the exhibition, Competing with Lightning. I was wondering how that connects to the work that you're presenting here.
Sure. When I was thinking about the fact that it's going to be kind of a survey of 25 years of painting and these two bodies, I thought about kind of like what it is to be a painter and what you're trying to do in creating a painting. And in some ways it's like trying to take a photo of the lightning. You know, it's like you're trying to distill these moments that really carry so much other things behind it. And then I also knew that I would create the Talking Shit with Amaru piece. And Amaru is a god from Peru, or there's many different versions of Amaru, but in one of them, Amaru is destroyed by a bolt of lightning. And so to me, I liked that idea of like as a painter, like trying to compete with this like supernatural force, you know, and in some ways to make that impact, you know.
Hi. I'm curious to know, I'm fascinated that there's such an intellectual approach and a deep understanding of cultures that you bring to all of this. And I'm really curious about your process. You mentioned that you have 2 studios. I'm so curious how much the artwork downstairs represents, like what portion of the body of your work that you currently have, and do you have teams? Do you go away and read for a while and come back?
God, the mechanics of it are kind of insane. No, I have teams. I have had teams. There have been times where the demand has really pushed me to have numerous people. But I found that to be, it removed me from the magic of making the work. But there's, you know, there's always that balance, you know, having to, especially on that scale, the large scale works. The works that are up in Philadelphia right now are massive pieces that I needed people to work with on that. And so, yeah, I think I've gotten into a rhythm of you know, being able to set things and then step away and kind of go retreat into my space to be able to think more on these more like conceptual ideas. And it is a balance, and it's tough. I do want to re-engage with video and music because I think those things, in a lot of ways, that's like kind of where the rubber hits the road a bit more with some of these concepts. But yeah, I just kind of like go as I can. Yeah.
And I mean, you also spent a number of years teaching, right?
I taught at Cal State Bakersfield. And yeah, I mean, it's an extension of my interest in community. And I think those more intellectual kind of exercises, to me, that's like why I got into art. You know, to me, that's that part of the work that isn't just interested in the formal exercise. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, there's somebody back there. Yeah.
Thank you. How do you manage your time and all these ideas in different places like art, visual art, music? You are involved in so many things that they do have like something that binds them together. But it's incredible how versatile you are. How do you manage your mind, basically? Because you must be running.
You're implying that there's a way that I manage it. My more kind of ambitious approach to music is definitely on hold. A lot of what is happening in terms of the attention that I'm getting for my music is from work from years ago. Like, you know, I was part of a collective in San Francisco that's kind of the first Latinx, Latino, Chicano record collecting kind of crew that was doing more of this kind of sonidero, and we were just kind of almost like archiving things in some ways. And so I think a lot of that, because we were kind of the first in that, a lot of it just unfolds. It kind of just unfurls from that, because that's part of that community element. When you are part of a community, so much work is just kind of, it's almost passive work because it's just part of what we do, you know? But I think the more specific things like production, music production and things like that, I haven't really stepped towards it too much lately. Like painting has been entirely what I've been focused on. I think the extension of the Talking Shit series is probably going to be the most expansive version of painting that's going to be coming out, you know, in the coming years, because that's kind of where my mind is at. And that's, speaking of that organizing, like it's kind of like, okay, I want to live in this space for a while, you know. But things like there's an album that they'll have here in the gift shop. I think it's underway. They're trying to get it from the distributor, but it's an album that was based on a mix that I made in 2008. And this German record producer approached me and said, I want to do an album with you. And I said, this is back in 2008. And I said, yeah, I want to do it. I want to do a sonidero, a rebajada album. And he looked at me so confused. And then I explained it to him and I played it for him. And he still was like, I don't get it. And then you fast forward 12 years later, and now he came out with this compilation, and it's really very good and well researched. It comes with a book, and you can't find it. It's like people wanted it, like, you know, because it took him that long to understand it. Like, so those things just pop up and the same with the cube, in the LA Times story, you know, that is something from 15 years ago that now has this, you know, so it's almost like cosechando semillitas por donde voy. So I think that's like planting seeds and then letting them grow later, you know. Yeah.
I'm really struck by the colors in your picture, and I wish you could talk a little bit about your color choices. Also, that form is very dominant, of course, in the lower and the upper part. What struck me most are the colors, and maybe you can talk a little bit about that. Thank you.
Specifically about the works upstairs?
I think both. I mean, the progress from the more uniform color palette in the first floor to a more expanded one that is also a little more visionary, I think.
Yeah.
And maybe also include your use of the color gold.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
That's a great question. A lot of times I draw the kind of origin of my color theory, I guess you would call it, to Josue Sanchez in a lot of ways because of the impact his painting made on me. He painted with house paint, and so it's highly saturated, and always rooted like very close to the primary colors, not so much into the tertiary and beyond. And so those for the first floor works are, you know, the blue is like electric because it's a very primary, almost kind of baby blue almost, you know. It's like the blue sky that we're looking at. And then the green is also highly saturated green. And so then, you know, going upstairs, that color approach, it starts to get a little bit more refined, you know, and it starts to play with those more tertiary colors and tinted colors. And the tinted colors a lot of times, too, are like, you know, there is a certain critique in the bottom floor, too. And I would even, maybe you could say about the abstract works as well, but is a critique of Southwestern art, you know? And, like, kind of, like, growing up in Arizona, it's like you're subjected to so much terrible Southwestern art that... I mean it in the kitschy, like the, you know, the land of enchantment type of art, and so in some ways the palette is to make that a serious palette, you know, how to like elevate it, you know, like I think Barragan, the Mexican architect, does that really well, you know, where it's like I'm gonna take these really vibrant colors that in other contexts, and especially European painters, view as like not intellectually, they're too playful. They're not serious enough. And he takes them and he makes them these very serious, beautiful backgrounds for these structures, you know. And so to me, that was that there's an element of that in it. And then also there's just the pure beauty of playing with, you know, adjacent colors. You know, I love purple. Right now, like I'm really into smoky purple, and I like to kind of take that and tilt it towards green and tilt it towards these things that maybe you wouldn't think that they would be simpatico. And then the gold, specifically in the infinite regress work, is to speak directly to the history of gold in Peru and the ritual significance of gold. And you know, there's a lot to unpack in that. I mean, that we could be here another hour for that. But yes, the gold in that sense is when the material has a memory and the material has a history, that's where it appears, you know, or that's where it combines, is in that form. And the infinite regress is totally inspired by Peruvian gold work. You know, there's a one-to-one inspiration, but it's within a personal vision where the form gets modified and changed. Yeah.
Can you hear me? Okay, great. Thank you so much for being here tonight. It's really such a treat. My question is around, I guess, the more meditative, at least for me, elements of, you know, your abstract paintings. I mean, whether it's at a crowded art fair or at a museum, every time I encounter it, I just feel like time stops. So I was just curious how sort of the meditative or more spiritual aspects kind of, you know, work into your process. Do you feel like, I guess, the weight of just, you know, all these transcultural, art historical kind of influences kind of weigh on you or work into the meditative aspect of your making?
Yeah, there's always, you know, there's sometimes, like, speaking to the kind of more medicinal elements or homeopathic elements of the act of painting, like, can get very flattened into just, you know, this like one experience of just, this is how you're supposed to experience it. But I do think there's, like, behind that there is the ability for the form, that kind of body experience with painting, that that's the doorway into the conversations, you know, into these bigger conversations. And so, like, in that sense, like, I think of painting as an act of generosity in a lot of ways. And I think of, you know, the infinite regress works in particular come from, like, a very specific experience that was very difficult and very painful in my life. And so, and that form just kind of appeared during that time. It's not like I sat and tried to do mathematic formulations as to how this should be expressed, you know. It's like that thing that just occurs, you know. And so in that sense, it's tied to that notion of spirituality or metaphysicality. But the more that you then open that door and you unpack, like, that idea of gold and ideas of like spiritualism, like the concept that I'm talking about with the gold is also, like, you know, in our history, our objects have all been, like, melted down, you know, like our best objects that we won't ever know, you know, some of the things that, like, we're lucky to have some of the notion of our past in my particular part of the world, you know, and Florencia, you know, because these little tiny elements survived in some archive in Germany, you know, like we won't know how beautiful some of the objects were and what power that they had. And so in some ways it's a reclamation on that level. is like, how do I make that gold function ritualistically in my life and have a different value? You know what I mean? And so, yes, like it is tied to a certain kind of metaphysicality, but it's always going to have that connection to like kind of my own understanding of what that material is and my own relationship to that material. But I do believe in the power of like the seduction of painting. You know, like I think that that's an important way for painting to function. You know, I also really enjoy the abject, but for me, it's like for my way of communicating is through that type of approach.
Thank you. Please join me in thanking our speakers.
Thank you.